I want you to understand what kind of woman my wife is before I tell you what her sister did to her. She's the kind of person who remembers everyone's coffee order. Not just mine, her mother's, her friends, the woman at the office who only comes by once a month. She keeps a little mental catalog, and it's not something she thinks about. It's just who she is. She notices people. She shows up. She does the thing without being asked, and she never, not once in the 22 years I've known her, has expected a thank you for it. That's important. Remember that. Her sister Vivian is 3 years younger and cut from entirely different cloth. I've known Vivian since she was 23, so I'm not working from some outsider impression. I know her. I know how she moves through a room like she's calculating the angles. I know the way she phrases things, so they sound like invitations but land like assignments. My wife has spent her whole life believing the best of Vivian, and I've spent most of mine quietly watching and choosing not to say too much, because when you love someone, you don't go picking at the stitches that hold their family together. This past Christmas, Vivian finally pulled the thread too hard. My wife's name is Susan. We live in Burlington, Ontario. Been here for 16 years. I work in commercial property management. Susan is a dental hygienist, 3 days a week now since she cut back, which was supposed to give her more breathing room, more time for herself. That's what her doctor suggested after the vertigo last spring. Stress, he said. Slow down. So she did. She started painting again. Something she hadn't touched since before our kids were born. She was getting good at it. She was starting to look like herself again in a way I hadn't noticed she'd stopped. Vivian lives in Mississauga with her husband Troy and their 2 kids, about 40 minutes away on a good day. 90 if the 403 is doing what the 403 does. Troy is fine. He's one of those guys who laughs a lot and doesn't say much. I've never had a problem with Troy specifically, and I want to be fair about that. The Christmas arrangement we'd had for years was simple. We alternated. 1 year Susan's family at our place, the next year at Vivian and Troy's. It had worked fine. Susan did most of the cooking at our house, but Vivian helped and their mother helped, and it was a reasonable spread of effort. At Vivian's, she ordered platters from a catering company, which was fine. Nobody complained, the food was decent, and it meant everyone relaxed. In November, 2 weeks before we'd started thinking about menus, Susan got a text from Vivian. She showed it to me that evening. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her phone and she had a look on her face I've seen before. Not hurt exactly, more like confused in a way she was already talking herself out of. The text was about 4 paragraphs long. I'll give you the shape of it. Vivian explained that this Christmas was going to be really special because her in-laws were flying in from Calgary and some of Troy's family from out east, and she was also inviting their boss and his wife, who had apparently become close friends. The total guest count was somewhere between 22 and 25, depending on travel. She was hosting at her place. Then she got to the part about food. She wanted a full sit-down Christmas dinner. Turkey, 2 of them, since the crowd was large. Stuffing made from scratch, the kind their mother used to make. Mashed potatoes, roasted carrots, green bean casserole, glazed parsnips, a cranberry sauce that was not from a can, please. Tourtière because Troy's Quebec relatives would appreciate it, and it had to be homemade. Dinner rolls, also homemade. A cheese board as a starter. 3 desserts, a Yule log, a butter tart pie, and something light, maybe a pavlova. She listed it out, actually listed it, in a text. And then at the end she wrote, "I know this is a lot, but honestly you're the best cook in the family, and I'd rather have your food than anything else. We'd love to have you both there by 8 in the morning to get started. Let me know." Susan read it twice. I watched her do it. "She wants me to make tourtière," she said. "I see that. I've made tourtière once. At Christmas. It took me an entire day. I know." She put her phone down. She picked up her tea. She looked out the window at our backyard, at the bird feeder she'd put up in September that had finally started getting cardinals. "She's hosting 25 people," Susan said. "And she wants me to show up at 8 in the morning and cook for them. That's what it says." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, she said I'm the best cook in the family. And this is the thing about Susan. This is the thing I love about her, and that also, sometimes, makes me want to gently take her by the shoulders." She heard that as a compliment. She was already weighing it, holding it up, deciding if it was enough reason to say yes. I didn't say anything right away. I've learned over the years that Susan needs to arrive at things on her own timeline. If I jump in too fast, she defends whatever position she was about to abandon. So I waited. She texted Vivian back that evening and said the list looked ambitious and maybe they could split some of it up. She could bring a few dishes and others could contribute too. It was a reasonable response. It was the kind of thing any normal person would say. Vivian replied the next morning. The reply was cheerful, breezy even. She explained that Troy's family wasn't really cooks, and her mother-in-law had a bad back, so asking them to contribute wasn't realistic. She said Susan's mother had already said she'd help with some of the prep, which was a detail that turned out later to be significantly exaggerated. And she said she was sure it would be manageable if they got an early start. She added a little smiley face. Susan showed me that one too. She didn't say much about it. She said okay, in a tone that wasn't actually okay, and then she started looking up tortilla recipes. I watched this happen for about a week. I watched her start a grocery list. I watched her look up how long a turkey brine takes. I watched her pull out her big Le Creuset and check if we had the right size. And I thought about what her doctor had said in the spring. About stress. About slowing down. About the vertigo that had been bad enough some mornings. That she'd had to sit down on the bathroom floor and wait for the room to stop moving. I thought about the painting she'd been doing, and how the Christmas week would wipe out any time she had for that. I thought about the 8 o'clock start time, 8 in the morning on Christmas Day, at someone else's house, for 25 people including her sister's boss. I didn't say anything yet, but something was building in me quietly. About 10 days before Christmas, Susan talked to her mother, who mentioned somewhat casually that Vivian hadn't actually spoken to her about helping with prep. Her mother thought she was coming for dinner, not an 8-hour cooking shift. That was when the first crack appeared in Susan's composure, though she tried to smooth it over when she was talking to me about it. She said maybe there was a miscommunication. I said gently, "She sent a list, Suze. That wasn't a miscommunication." Susan didn't respond to that. 2 days later, she came to me and said Vivian had also asked if we could pick up the groceries. For everything, because Vivian didn't really know what to buy, and Susan knew exactly what she needed. The estimated grocery bill, based on the list, was somewhere around $400, and that was when I said something. I didn't yell. I'm not a yelling person. But I sat down at the table and I said, "I need to say something, and I need you to actually hear it." She sat down across from me. I said, "What she's asking you to do is not a favor. It's a catering job. She's asking you to shop for, transport, and cook a full restaurant-scale Christmas dinner for 25 people, including people you've never met, at a house that isn't ours, on a day that's supposed to be a holiday for you too." And she framed it as a compliment. Susan looked at the table. "The vertigo," I said. "The doctor, do you remember what he said?" "I remember. You've been better." "The painting. The slower schedule." "You've been better." She nodded. "I don't want to watch you spend Christmas week building up to this and then collapse on Boxing Day," I said. "I'm not willing to do that." She was quiet for a bit. Then she said, "What do I tell her?" And I said, "Tell her no, that's it, just no." She sat with that. I could see her working through it, the guilt, the obligation, the mental map she'd drawn of how Christmas was supposed to go, the version where she showed up and did the thing, and everyone was grateful, and it was fine. She'd drawn that map so many times she could do it with her eyes closed. "She's going to be upset," Susan said. "Maybe, that's okay. It'll make things awkward with Mum. It might. That's okay too." She looked at me for a long moment, then she said, "I don't want to fight about it. I just want a Christmas where I don't end up exhausted and resentful." I said, "Same." She said, "What if we went somewhere instead?" I hadn't expected that. I looked at her. "My friend Deborah has been asking us to come out to Kelowna for ages," she said. "Her family does a big open house on Christmas Day. It's nothing formal. Just people, food, the lake if it's not frozen solid." She said it quietly, like she was testing the words before she committed to them. I said, "When did Deborah ask?" "Last month." I said we'd probably be at family Christmas, so I didn't think much of it. "Do you want to go?" She looked at me with this expression I don't have a word for. It was something between hope and uncertainty, like she was asking permission to want something. I said, "I'm in." She blinked. "Just like that?" "Just like that." I booked the flights that night. We fly out Christmas Eve afternoon. We land in Kelowna at 6. Deborah is picking us up, and we are staying through the 27th. I found a good seat sale. It wasn't as expensive as I'd worried, and the hotel for the nights Deborah couldn't fit us is reasonable. We've been to Kelowna in summer, but never in winter. Apparently it's beautiful. Susan told Vivian by text the next afternoon. She kept it short. She said we'd made other plans for Christmas and wouldn't be able to make it. She said she hoped they had a wonderful celebration and that she'd love to see everyone in the new year. She didn't explain, she didn't apologize at length. She said what was true, and she stopped. Vivian called within the hour. Susan took the call. I sat nearby and heard one side of it, which was enough. Vivian's voice was audible even through the phone. Not yelling exactly, but with that particular quality of controlled agitation that people use when they're furious and trying to maintain the surface of reasonableness. Words like blindsided and already planned around you, and at one point clearly selfish. Susan said, I understand you're disappointed. Vivian said something else. Susan said, I know. I'm sorry it's come up late, but we've made our plans. There was a longer speech from Vivian then. Something about the in-laws, something about what Troy's family was going to think, something about how Susan had always been the reliable one, and she'd been counting on that. Susan said, I'm not available this Christmas. I hope you find a good solution. And she ended the call. She sat there for a minute with her phone in her lap. I didn't say anything. She put it face down on the table. Then she said, she's going to be fine. She can order catering like she does every other year. I said, yep, the tourtière thing was never going to happen anyway. Who has time for tourtière? I said. Nobody has time for tourtière. She laughed a little at that, just a small laugh. But it was real. Her mother called that evening. That conversation was trickier. Her mother wasn't angry exactly, but she was worried about family harmony in the way mothers often are. Not taking sides exactly, but gently asking whether it might be possible to work something out. Susan was patient with her. She explained, without too much detail, that she'd been asked to do something that was more than she was able to give right now, and that she and I had decided to use the holiday to rest. Her mother was quiet for a bit and then said she understood, and that she hoped Susan was taking care of herself. She called back 2 days later and said, I think you did the right thing. That mattered to Susan. I could see it in her face when she got off the phone. The week before Christmas was different than any we'd had in years. We weren't shopping for ingredients we didn't need or calculating timelines for dishes we weren't making. We wrapped our own small gifts, the ones for the friends we were seeing in Kelowna. We went to the grocery store and bought the specific things we actually like. A nice piece of salmon, good cheese. The particular crackers Susan has always liked but says are too expensive to justify. We sat around and watched old films in the evening without any sense of things undone hanging over us. Susan painted 3 days in a row. She was working on a series of winter landscapes, and she'd gotten the light right, finally, on the one she'd been struggling with. This particular blue-gray of the sky just before dark that she said she couldn't capture. She got it. She came downstairs and told me, and her eyes were bright in a way I hadn't seen in a while. Christmas Eve we drove to the airport, December, so the 407 was doing the thing it does, but we'd left with enough time. We checked our bags, had lunch in the terminal, and got on the plane. We landed in Kelowna in the early evening. The mountains were dark against the sky, and there was snow on them. But the valley was clear and cold and smelled different from home, in a way I always notice when I'm here. Cleaner somehow, drier. Deborah was at arrivals with a sign that said, Merry Christmas, strangers, which was very Deborah. We had dinner at her house that night with her husband and their teenage kids and their neighbor who comes for everything. It was loud and warm, and nobody asked us to cook anything. Christmas morning we woke up in Kelowna. There was frost on the window of the hotel. We made coffee with the in-room machine, which is never as good but is still coffee. And we sat in bed and called my mother in Halifax and then her mother in Hamilton, and those were good calls. Short, warm, everyone in decent spirits. The open house at Deborah's started at noon. There must have been 40 people through over the course of the afternoon, neighbors, cousin old friends of Deborah's, from her work. People who'd been coming for years. Someone brought a lasagna. Someone else brought samosas. There was a tourtière, an actual tourtière, and I caught Susan's eye when we saw it, and she started laughing and couldn't quite explain why to the woman who'd brought it. We ate well. We talked to people. A retired teacher from Penticton who knew everything about birds. A young couple who'd just bought property up on the bench and were figuring out what to grow. Deborah's cousin, who worked in film in Vancouver and had a lot of stories. It was the kind of afternoon that doesn't have an agenda, and those are the kinds of afternoons I'd forgotten were possible at Christmas. Vivian called at 3:47 in the afternoon. Susan's phone lit up on the table beside her wine glass. She looked at it for a moment. then looked at me. She let it ring. When the call ended, she turned the phone face down. Deborah asked, "Everything okay?" Susan said, "Yes. Someone needed something. It can wait." She picked up her wine and went back to the conversation. Later, in the drive back to the hotel, she checked the voicemail. I don't know exactly what it said. She listened to it with the phone against her ear, and I watched her face, which went through a couple of expressions I recognized. Something like empathy, something like exhaustion, and then settled into a kind of quiet. She put the phone in her pocket. "Catering fell through," she said. Aha. She wanted to know if I had any suggestions for last-minute options at 3:47 on Christmas Day. Yes, we drove in silence for a moment. The lights of the valley were on below us, and the mountains were dark shapes against the sky. "Did you respond?" I asked. "Not yet." "You going to?" She thought about it. "Tomorrow," she said. "I'll text her tomorrow. There's a place in Mississauga I think does Christmas catering. I'll look it up." I looked at her. She said, "She's still my sister." I said, "I know. That doesn't mean I was wrong." "No," I said. "You weren't wrong." We pulled into the hotel. The mountains were still there, dark and patient, the way mountains are. She got out of the car and took a breath of the cold, dry air and looked up for a second before we went inside. The next 2 days were ours. We hiked the KVR trail on the 26th, even though it was cold, and we were underdressed and had to turn back earlier than planned. We found a little restaurant in downtown Kelowna that had the best mushroom soup I've had in years. Susan bought a small painting at a gallery we wandered into. Local artist, soft winter palette. Something about the composition reminded her of what she'd been working on at home. We talked about things we hadn't talked about in a while. Not problems, just thoughts. Plans. Things we might do differently next year. On the 27th, at the airport waiting to fly home, Susan pulled out her phone and looked at it for a moment. "I texted her the restaurant's information yesterday," she said. "How'd that go?" She said, "Thanks." A pause. "That was it. That's something." She nodded. "It is." The plane home was quiet. Susan fell asleep somewhere over the Rockies, her head tilted against the window, the snow on the peaks below going orange in the late afternoon light. I sat next to her and didn't wake her up. She looked peaceful in the way she'd been looking at Christmas for years, but that I'd stopped remembering was possible. We got home late, unpacked quickly, slept in our own bed. In the morning she went downstairs before I did, and when I came down she was at the kitchen table with her coffee and her sketchbook, working on something. The bird feeder outside had a nuthatch on it, which she pointed out before she went back to drawing. I made my coffee and sat across from her. "How do you feel?" I asked. She looked up. She thought about it, which is something she always does. She actually thinks about questions before she answers them, which is one of the things I've always loved about her. "Good," she said. "Rested. Actually rested." She went back to her sketchbook. The nuthatch stayed on the feeder for a long time. We didn't say much else. We didn't need to.